Thank you. Let's see. I like to move, so I will use this. So thanks a lot for coming. This is indeed one of the branches of my research. I work on other topics, but I thought today, given the world in which we live, and in particular since the return of Trump in January, this has become even more salient. So this is indeed one of the areas of my research, and I thought I'll talk to you about that today. So I have 25 minutes, and you'll give me warnings, promise. Very good. So let me start very broadly. So we think today about all this protectionist measure, but if we think about the last 30 years, there are a lot of good things that have happened. Actually, trade barriers, rather than going up, have been falling down. So if we look at from 95 onwards, for example, exactly 30 years ago, there was the establishment of the World Trade Organization in 1995, which was the successor of the GATT. And this was really a new multilateral trade organization that brought together many countries, set new rules to govern trade in goods and services. And this organization also had a dispute settlement procedure, so set new international rules to cooperate on trade. And this organization started with, I think, 70-something members and then expanded to now almost 200. And there were big accession of big countries like China in 2001. So you had, the creation and expansion of the WTO, and the WTO also pushed multilateral trade barriers. So trade barriers that are applied, or tariffs that are applied between members of the WTO down. So this is all good at the multilateral level, again, liberalization among members of the WTO, but then also at the regional level, there's been a proliferation of regional trade agreements, both free trade agreements and customs union, mostly free trade agreements. And these, I'll show you in a second a slide that's showing you this, but not only the number has increased, but these free trade agreements have increased in depth. So in the past, trade agreements were covering mostly tariffs, and now more and more they cover environmental and labor standards, intellectual property rights, product safety standards. So they've really become deeper. So this is just to show you how rapidly they've grown in number. And the surge has really started again 30 years ago in the 90s. So you had, for example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, then different waves of enlargement of the EU, and many, many trade agreements negotiated bilaterally or regionally. But also, if you look at the coverage of these agreements, so this is just the number of policy areas covered, these have been increasing over time. Again, at the beginning, there was a narrow focus on tariffs and quotas and trade policy, and now trade policies have become deeper, and they're now covered by these trade agreements. So all of this has been a big push for trade liberalization over the last few decades. In this period, what you've also seen as a result of these falling trade barriers, both multilaterally and regionally, is this growth, expansion of trade of roughly 5 times. Since 1995, we have had a 5-fold increase in trade, well over the growth of GDP. So this has been an incredible, increase. This is a globalization really era. And a lot of it is actually trade, roughly 2/3, according to some estimates, is actually trade in intermediate rather than final goods. So all these parts and components, partly as a result of the fact that during the same period, because of falling trade barriers, but also the ICT revolution, production processes have been fragmented across countries. So it used to be that if you're a car company in Detroit or Ford, the original Ford factory was all about doing things, with local suppliers. And now, car companies, but all companies, or your phones and everything is produced with parts and components that come from all over the world, and different stages of production processes are fragmented around the world. So a lot of this growth in trade has been facilitated or fostered by these trade barriers falling, and a lot of it is in parts and components due to the so-called GVC, Global Supply Chain Revolution. Now, when we look at, so these all seem so good, but in recent years, there seems to be a break in this globalization area. In particular, so if you look at actually this period, like from the start of the WTO till 2018, when Trump started his first term, or when he introduced his third round of trade barriers, there was a lot of protection still used. So trade barriers were falling, but there were protectionist measures being used. But these measures were compatible with multilateral trade rules. So in the multilateral agreement that was signed 30 years ago, there are circumstances under which governments can use anti-dumping duties, safeguards, countervailing duties, so they can protect their industries against import competition, sometimes unfair import competition. And so these kind of measures were used very regularly, and I would say increasingly so during this period, but they were still compatible with agreed upon multilateral rules. What happened in the recent few years, in particular since 2018, is that Trump started saying, no, I don't care about multilateral rules. Let me go my way. Let me introduce special tariffs that are incompatible with the rules that were being agreed multilaterally, that actually resorted to old principles from the 70s. So they were actually really forbidden by multilateral rules, and he started imposing them, mostly against China in his first term, but not only. And this led, of course, to retaliation. And there are now several studies showing that these measures also increase prices and production costs in the U.S. So they were actually detrimental for U.S. consumers and most producers, definitely those that were importing things. So this is what he did in this first term, but in a way it was still special tariffs that were quite targeted mostly on China and limited. But what we have had since January, since the start of his second term, is really a further surge in these special tariffs that are now all over the place. So if you look at these, actually it's very hard to document. So The Economist keeps having pieces, of like, where do we stand? But it's very hard. One of the problems is the uncertainty in trade policy. I'm going to mention this at the end, because there's a continuous change in the policy. But the WTO has recently put together, they're tracking U.S. trade tariffs. This is just a simple average, just to show you how in the last few months, the U.S. average tariff has quadrupled. So it started in February when Trump went after first Mexico and Canada, the neighbors, the members of the closest free trade agreement, and he started imposing unilaterally barriers. And then, of course, there was Liberation Day in April, where lots of countries saw their tariffs increase, and then there have been several waves since. So there's been a major increase, and this, of course, has led to retaliation, and then we'll talk later about special trade deals. But so this is really a different era, and one that really threatens the whole system. So I'm going to get to this at the end. So today I'm not going to talk to you about Trump and the recent days, also because I don't, it's very hard to do research on something that is a moving target. And so I'm going to talk to you more generally about, so you see trade policy. What I talk to you about is, on one hand, a lot of changes on trade policy towards trade liberalization that have occurred over the last 30 years, but a lot of use, and increasingly so, of protectionist measures. So what I want to talk to you about is a bit of my research agenda that talks about or covers the political factors that shape this trade policy, both in terms of what are the factors that could push towards the removal of trade barriers, and what are the factors that can push governments to instead increase or use protectionist measures. And there are two sets of such political factors that I've been, emphasizing in my work in this topic. On one hand is lobbying by special interest, and on the other hand is the re-election motives, the electoral incentives of incumbent politicians. And so in various of my papers with various sets of co-authors, I've looked at these factors. Let me give you just the punchline, I would say, of some of the key results, and then I will just give you a brief overview of like two projects and go a bit more in details with no equations and no models, but just to give you a bit more of a sense of in depth of some of these factors. So in terms of lobbying, what is striking, and I'll give you an idea in a second, is that really lobbying is not, if you look at who are the key players when it comes to lobbying, they're not industries or unions, they're really large, firms that are mostly multinational firms. So and this is not just about trade policy, by the way. If you look at lobbying on environment, IPR, like any policy, is the large corporations that dominate lobbying. You can look at that very in detailed way with the US, as I'll show you later. But even I have students who have looked at Brussels and Europe, where lobbying is very different. It's harder to document. Even there, it's large corporations that dominate lobbying. What do they lobby on? When it comes to trade policy, their preferences depend on the policy you're looking at. So if you're looking at unilateral policies that governs, unilateral impose, well, they like protection on their final goods, but they dislike and oppose protection on their intermediate inputs, obviously. In terms of trade agreement, which are reciprocal, as I'll show you, they actually push for trade agreements. So for the reciprocal reduction in tariffs, very clearly, and I'll show you that. And not only they push for this reduction in tariffs, but they also push for including in the content of this trade agreement policies, non-tariff policies that are favorable to them in terms of the stricter intellectual property rights or their favorable kind of regulation, they sort of bind their favorable non-tariff provisions. So a lot of the literature in political economy or trade thought lobbying is all there is, and it's all about industry. I'm going to show you actually there is a lot of role for lobbying, but it's mostly about large firms. But electoral incentives really matter too, and in several of my papers I show that. I'm going to give you an example in a second. In general, politicians, when it comes to office-motivated politicians, what they put more weight on the interests of voters that are protectionists rather than pro-trade, and they do so more closer to election, and they care more about protectionist voters, particularly if they are in states they can swing, or in these voters can actually swing the overall election. I'm going to give you a flavor of these in these two projects. So let me go briefly because I'm worried of Michael and his warning. So let me tell you a little bit about one project about lobbying, again, in a very informal way. So this is a paper that was recently published entitled Lobbying for Globalization. And again, what we are focusing is one type of trade policy, these free trade agreements. When I showed you this surge at the beginning, this increase in the number, most of these regional trade agreements, 90% of them are free trade agreements. The remaining ones are customs unions, like the EU. So free trade agreements, what do? When countries sign a free trade agreement, they eliminate reciprocally all tariffs. So this is, for example, now the case for the EU-UK free trade agreement. The UK used to be in the customs union. Now it has this free trade agreement, the TCA. So what the traditional view, if you are academically minded, but Banu told me to remove all quotes, you would think of Grossman-Hellman, their famous papers from the 90s, say it's all about lobbying for protection by industries, import-competing industries. This, in the 90s, you had no data. And also it was a time in which people didn't think about firm heterogeneity within industries. In reality, when you look at the data, industry play a very small role. In fact, lobbying is mostly by individual firms, and it's mostly, as I'll show you, by large corporations. And instead of lobbying for protection, they all lobby for these free trade agreements to go through. So it's very striking against the traditional view. So this is just to show you, the colors are not coming through very much, but so you see that firms pay, I think, 10 times as much as industry association and 58 times as much as trade unions. So these are individual firms, and these are the lobbying expenditures on free trade agreements. When you look at their size, so if you compare firms that are lobbying from firms that are not lobbying, and here is comparing within Compista. So you're already a set of firms, the population of firms is already large listed firms. Even within large listed firms, those that are lobbying are much larger. You see the distribution of sales is shifted to the right. And this is true for sales and employment. And the overwhelming majority of them are multinational, so they have subsidiaries around the world. Finally, and that's the most striking fact, if you look at the firms that are lobbying on free trade agreements, like 99-point-something%, they are lobbying in favor. And here I want to give you, could you look on this example? Because I want to give you a sense of the meat. How we can get to this number? So what is incredible, and this is going to be too small, but it gives you an idea of the kind of forensic analysis you can do for the US. Because you're not on Acrobat. Okay, so here it's a kind of lobbying report that you can get for the US, and it's part of our data set for this paper. So you have here Philip Morris International is lobbying when in 2008 in the third quarter. And here you see it's reporting, because you have to report every quarter how much you lobby on which issue. So it's reporting and spending around a bit over $1 million on, and in the next page, maybe go just quickly and then we can go back. It says, okay, you have to report the broad issue and this TRD, which is the issue code for trade, and specifically, it's lobbying for the implementation of the US-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And it's lobbying for the entire implementation and enactment of the entire bill. So this is going to be one observation, say, okay, this is a company that selects to lobby, participates on lobbying on free trade agreement and lobbies in favor. And you can also look at the company official statements, and which we have also collected, if you can go back. So the striking thing is really that it's very different from this old-fashioned protection for sale, where you expect all these, any trade liberalization effort would be met by strong opposition by industries. In fact, you see that industry play a little role, and mostly it's about firms lobbying in favor. In terms of amount of money, so far I told you who lobbies, if you want, is in jargon, the extensive margin. If you look at the intensive margin, how much effort, how much money they spend, it's actually what you would expect. So they spend more, the more they have to gain. So we can look at each firm and how much it exports from a free trading partner, how much it imports from, how much increase in import competition it would suffer if the agreement enters into force, and the amount of money is related to exactly the expected gains of the company. And also, as the firms spend more when they expect more political opposition. So we have in the paper also, the point is, how can you make sense of these puzzling new facts? So what we do in the paper, and I'm, again, not presenting the model, but I want to give you the intuition of why we have these striking facts, in particular this pie chart that is almost all pro-free trade agreements, when you would expect some opposition. Well, so I think what really you need is a few ingredients. One is that within an industry, not all firms have the same interest. And this has been, by the way, a revolution in international trade since Mark Mellit's seminal paper in the early 2000s. You have that we understand now that there is a lot of heterogeneity in productivity, size, profitability across firms within a sector. Think again of like textile and apparel. You could have small T-shirt producers and Nike. And obviously their interest when it comes to trade policy and any other policy will be very different, because if you are Nike, you are exporting, you are importing, you have foreign subsidiary. If you're a small producer, if you have fixed costs to participate in international trade. So if you can only afford to participate in trade, in exporting, importing, setting up subsidiary, if you're large and productive enough, what you have is that it's the Nikes that are globalized and not the small firms. What you need to add is some other fixed cost of being politically organized. So if you look at that example that I gave you, what you have, the Philip Morris has a huge in-house lobbying department. In fact, there is a tick you can choose to lobby via an external lobbying firm, or you're lobbying internally. Most firms lobbying through their in-house lobbying department, which is huge, and not every firm can afford doing so, and have all the political connection with Congress, USTR, etc. So what you have also is selection into lobby, again, by whom? By the largest firms. So in the end, what you have is that what you observe as the firms that are lobbying on these free trade agreements are the biggest firms that are selecting into lobby and selecting into international trade, the various margin, and they're gaining from these free trade agreements. Because although, think about US-Korea free trade agreement. So if you are a U.S. car manufacturing company, on one hand, yes, the fact that you have this chorus agreement entering into force means you have more competition from car makers in Korea, because the U.S. would eliminate tariffs on cars. But since this free trade agreement eliminates all tariffs reciprocally, this same firm can also gain by having better access to the Korean market and cheaper cost of importing, because you are eliminating also tariff on intermediate. So in the end, these firms gain. You can show this theoretically, and the firms that participate are the largest winners. If you are smaller than a certain cutoff, you're not going to participate. You could be a small winner, or you could be a loser, and you're not going to be part of the game. So let me now move to, in very little time I've left, just to give you a glimpse of, it's not all about lobbying. Electoral incentives matter too. And let me give you an idea of more of another recent project I have with different sets of co-authors. So if you look at there's a lot of anecdotal evidence and media, quotes about electoral incentive, in particular in the United States, incentives to favor swing states, and using trade policy to favor swing states. These are examples for George W. Bush first term that used very extensively trade policy to favor states they were expected to be swing in the next election, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin at the time. What we do in this project is to actually collect very systematic evidence from the 80s till today on the tariffs implemented by the United States, and show that actually there are really systematic incentive in the first terms of US executive, like this was the case of George W. Bush first term. There's really a systematic manipulation of US trade policy in favor of industries that are important in states that are expected to swing the presidential election. So we really have this systematic evidence. And not only that, we show that these politically motivated trade barriers are really having positive effect on the protected industry, but very negative effects along supply chain. So if you impose a measure on steel because you want to win gains, votes in Ohio because Ohio is maybe swinging the next election, or Pennsylvania, these has repercussions that are negative, and we can quantify them for the car industry, the construction industry, all industries rely on protected goods as inputs. So this is just a map just to show you of like the fact that swing states, this is the probability the states are swing based on the, a model that on the probabilistic voting model that allows you to look at the probability the states will swing the electoral outcome. And what we show again that during first terms, so not when the president is a lame duck, cannot be reelected, but during the first terms when there are reelection motives, what you see is that actually the temporary trade barriers, anti-dumping duties, safeguard countervailing duties are in. So when Florida is swing, you get these 230% duties on shrimps, even though the restaurant industry complains. When Ohio is swing, you get these increase in steel duties, etc. And these, not only we find, we document the politics matter and electoral incentives matter in a very systematic way, but we quantify the losses. So our estimates, we can do counterfactual, then look at what are the gains and losses in terms of mostly employment, but other outcomes as well. And we find that if you look at the protected industry, those industries that get protected by these politically motivated, especially, temporary trade barriers, they grow in terms of employment and they have higher prices during the time in which they are protected. But the downstream sectors, both in manufacturing and outside manufacturing, are really negatively affected. And if you look at the net employment effects, there are net employment losses that are actually sizable. So overall, this is really, politics, these office-motivated politicians can actually introduce policies that are favorable to their enhance the re-election chances, but have aggregate negative effects for the overall economy. And finally, this is my very last slide. So going back to the big picture. So, I think politics is not new. It's not that Trump has done anything new. If we look at the last 30 years, politics in terms of lobbying, electoral incentive, have shaped trade policy. But there were rules. There were rules of the game. Like, again, these duties that I was talking about, they were still regulated by multilateral rules. You can introduce anti-dumping under this condition, etc. Now, the system, really, the multilateral trading system that has allowed certainty and has allowed this growth in trade and economic growth over the last few decades is falling apart. There are obviously geopolitical tensions, in particular US-China. Within the WTO, there are more and more prohibited tariffs being used that really go against the principle of non-discrimination, Article 1 of the WTO. This is all now abandoned, and there's increasing retaliation, uncertainty. I wanted to put a picture of trade policy uncertainty index is like all over. So if you're investing and you want to invest, even you want to invest in the US, which is what Trump wants, why would you do it in such an uncertain times? And here is where I want to pick also your brain. A lot of the deals, including the US trade deal, if you want to call it as such, which was the first deal Trump negotiated, are really against the rules. And they're also not covering a lot of we can discuss this, but I think this is actually one of the major problems. And there's no more a dispute settlement system. So really the threat, and it's a real concern. So the last time we were here is in 1930s when the US introduced the so-called, the famous smooth-only tariffs. This was a huge increase in protection, and that led to retaliation and trade wars at the time. And that led to a recession. And possibly you could say then we had a World War. And after the World War, Bretton Woods institutions were put there to avoid going back to this beggar thy neighbor trade war, let's unilaterally increase. And rules were set to cooperate. And I think now we are really at the time where either we save the rules or things are not going to be good for companies, and I don't want to be. I'm very optimistic, but yeah, let's leave it. Let me stop because I think I'm right on time. No.